Today, I'm going to finish up talking about social mobility in the pre-industrial world and show you it's a world of surprising social mobility. And then I'm going to go on and talk about the great issue in world history, which is why the rate of technological advance is so slow in the world before 1800. And in part, I want to show you that there's an extraordinary social mobility in this pre-industrial world because a lot of the kind of Monty Python-esque ideas that modern economists have about why growth can't occur before 1800 are based on an idea that it's a feudal society where people are stuck in particular places, where there aren't possibilities of economic advancement. And so one of the great puzzles we have to look at here is it turns out that, at least in societies like England, the pre-industrial world is actually one of extraordinary social mobility, of very free markets, of very little government interference, but it can still be a world with very, very little technological advance. So in terms of looking at social mobility, the important thing here is that this is some additional stuff I've done since the book came out, and so there's a reading on the syllabus for you on this, and you should absolutely have a look at that. And so the question that comes up is, well, how do we trace social mobility over very long periods of time? And this is in a world where the first census in England is not till 1801, and the first census that actually identifies individuals is not till 1841. And the technique that we're going to use here are people's surnames. And there is this feature of England that there's a group of people that have very common surnames, such as mine, Clark. But there's a large fraction of the population that have surnames that may be held only by them and their brother, by them and a few other relatives. And it turns out that in 1600, we can actually identify a group of very poor, very marginal people with these very rare surnames, where a lot of them, they'll be the only person holding that surname, or there's only a few relatives who hold it in 1600. And then also a group of very rich people who again have these very rare surnames. And remember, some of these rare surnames are names like Beware, Breadcake, Spill Timber, Crowfoot, Face Brown, Many Penny. A lot of these are actually surprisingly odd surnames. Free Love, Fine Glass, I mentioned Gather Coal, Hen Games, Hog's Flesh. It is amazing the names that people ended up with. But a lot of them are just very ordinary sounding names, except that very, very few people hold these names. And as I say, we're able to identify these because we've got a list of about 1%, 1.5% of all the surnames that anyone held in England around 1600. And so if we just check, are these names on that list, then any name that has any frequency will not occur on that list, right? And so then we get these two groups, and the indicted are typically laborers. A large fraction of them are illiterate. They're living on the margins of society. They're people who are very unsuccessful economically. The rich are typically owners of land, merchants, mostly literate, even by this stage. And as I say, what we can do is trace to the 1851 census the ancestors along the male line of these two groups of people, just by looking for those names in the 1851 census, which is actually all online, and you can then actually trace out and say how many people are there. And we also check for obvious spelling variants, right? English spelling, if there's an E on the end of a name, it often didn't mean anything in terms of spelling, and so we check for the obvious variants. And then, because this sieve we have for tracing rare names is not perfect, what we actually do is just take, first thing is, well, what's the median occurrence of these names by the time you get to the 1851 census? So for the indicted, there are only 27 people at the median, at the middle of the distribution, that actually hold those names. Now, since English population between those two dates had increased by more than fourfold, if they're holding their share in the population, it would imply that the median number of people holding that name back in 1600 would have to just be 7 people, okay? And so their median number is not very large, and the number of these names that have just disappeared are 21%. So in a fifth of these cases, these people left no descendants in the male line, right? So, which implies that their Y chromosome disappeared from the population, right? It turned out that surnames, in some sense, they trace the Y chromosome in the population, okay? And for the richest testators, it turns out that they left 115 descendants that seem to bear the name, or the name of probably a close relative in 1600. And then the number that had simply disappeared was only 8%. And so the first thing that shows up is that you really do see this phenomena of survival of the richest, that there is this reward to having economic success in early generation in the population here, which is that there's more copies of your genes that seem to be around in the society by 1851. And as I say, the difference here is about 4-to-1 in terms of this difference. Now, that's checking the census for the whole of England. In fact, here's the quick drawing of England. In fact, these records all come from this area in East Anglia in 1600. And people, even by 1851, are not dramatically mobile within this society. They move to some degree, but a lot of that movement is local. And so what we can do in 1851 is take these original counties, plus every county that borders them, and then check and see how strong this effect is if we look locally. And the idea here would be, if in 1851 there's someone up here who bears the same name as one of these original people, then that might well be just accident, right? Same name came up somewhere else. There's likely to be very little relationship. Whereas the people who are living in this area here, and this includes London, is right down here, are likely to be the ones who are really related to the original people. And so if this is a correct effect, if it's really coming from your descendants producing more children, having more success, we would expect that the effect would be stronger if we looked in this area. But we can also look outside that area, and then the effect should be much weaker in terms of predicting the frequency of the occurrence of these names. And so first of all, let's just look within that local area. What's the median numbers then if we look within the southeast of England? Now for the indicted, there are only 9 people on average bearing those same, at the median, bearing those same names 250 years later. And the number of the names that have disappeared are actually 35%. So you really do see that lots of people are going to disappear in this pre-industrial world in terms of their descendants through the male line. And then for the richest, the number drops to 67, and the number disappearing increases to 17. But you could see that the effect is actually stronger if you look in the local area where these people were actually living, right? That there really is this powerful effect that just having a rare name but being indicted in this period is a predictor of how many people will actually hold that name later. And one possibility here, by the way, is, well, were the indicted actually changing their names because they were trying to avoid detection, something like that? It turns out that most of these names are not names that, that are of any particular significance, right? There's no reason for anyone to change these names. In this period, you can get indicted for some minor crime. You can spend the rest of your life quite happily. There's no lasting penalty. And so within the area, it is actually stronger. What about if we take the rest of the country, right? So this area constitutes about 1/5 of the country. What if we take the rest of the country? What does the effect look like there? Now, for the indicted, again, in the rest of the country, on average, there's 9, and then the name has disappeared in 33% of the cases. So as I say, these are people who are more likely to just be accidentally linked. For the richest now, there's only 20 in the rest of the country, and 20% of the time the name doesn't occur. And so you see that you get this nice effect that if we look at outside here, in the rest of the country, where these people are unlikely to be particularly closely connected, there's not that much difference between what's happening with the indicted and what's happening with the rich. But when we look at the people who are most likely to be connected, you see that the difference is actually more dramatic. And so it really seems that there is this long-run effect in pre-industrial England where economic success actually increases the share of your genes in the population. Because this, as I say, is tracing out the Y chromosome. So there's more copies of your Y chromosome in the population later on. So that's the first thing. Now, the second thing we can do with the census is to say, well, what happened by 1851 to the descendants of this original group in terms of their place in society? Is there a criminal class in pre-industrial England which stays always at the bottom of the social scale, right? Which never moves up, right? Which is gradually dying out and is always down there at the bottom? And is there a successful upper class which produces surplus children but tends to stay always at the top of this society, right? Do you get, in the long run, no mixing in this society between the bottom and the top, or what does it look like in the long run? And the way that we can examine that using the census is that the census in 1851 also records people's occupations. And people's occupations are highly correlated with their wealth and their social status. So the lowest occupation is typically laborer in this society. High occupations would be people also, some people are just described as gentlemen in this period. That denotes the fact that you're relatively high status, or esquire, or you could be a bishop, you know, a general, a professional, an architect. So that there are occupations that typically are associated with high status and typically high wealth. And there's some like laborer, which are really down at the bottom of the social scale. And so one thing we can just look at is, well, what percentage of these people are laborers by the time we get to 1851? Amongst the rich in 1600, none of these people are laborers. Amongst the indicted, something like 3/4 of them are laborers in this early period. What does it look like by the time we get to 1851? And here, we're just doing this for starting with the least common names that show up in 1851, right? Because, as I say, some of them, it ends up, the filter's not very good. There's 2,000 people who have that name by 1851. But what we find is amongst the indicted, 29% of them are now laborers. But amongst the descendants of the rich, 32% of them are laborers. And so it turns out that it looks like at the bottom end, there's complete mobility. That not all of the indicted have stayed at the bottom, the descendants, and that a large fraction of the children of the rich in 1600, the great-great-great-great-great-grandsons, have actually ended up at the bottom of the social ladder. And then at the other end, we can look at the percentage, which we'll say belong to the gentry by 1851. But that's also including professionals like architects, doctors, various other people in this stage. And amongst the indicted, it's 4% who've made it to the top of the social ladder. But amongst the rich, it's only about 6% who are at that same status. And so the data actually has this interesting implication, which is there are significant effects about whether you're at the bottom or the top of the social scale in 1600. But it has no effect on the long-run status of your descendants. There is complete mixing in the population in the long run. It's just that there'll be more descendants in the long run. So it's kind of an interesting world where, you know, in some sense, in the long run, we're all equal in a society like pre-industrial England, except for the fact that there'll be more copies of your DNA in the society in the later stages. And later I'm going to come and think about, well, what does that imply about some of the social forces in terms of culture and people's characteristics, if this is really a powerful effect through long periods of time in the pre-industrial world. But that's the story from 1600 to 1851. And one of the things I say that's interesting about this is that may imply that pre-industrial England had more social mobility than modern societies like America, because we can find groups within the US which don't achieve this complete mixing after 3 or 4 generations. And one of the problems in the modern world is that you actually can find groups who are at the bottom or at the top and who are not mixing in the modern world. And what's interesting about pre-industrial England is it seems to have actually greater social mobility, right? Now, one thing may be there might be some subgroup within the indicted or within the rich, which is actually not displaying this mobility. But as you can see, the rich, so many of them have moved down the social rung that it seems quite hard to believe that there's any actual group that's hanging on there systematically that has some characteristic that allows them to stay at the top of the ladder. So that's what happens in this period. It turns out that we can also examine social mobility even earlier in Britain. Well, hazards of teaching. And the way we can do that is, in this case, not by looking at rare names, but instead by looking at common names. Okay? And the important thing is that surnames in England, in the southeast at least, are pretty much complete by about 1300. Most people have taken surnames by about 1300. And surnames are formed in various ways. Some people are named after the town they came from. Some people are named after personal characteristics, such as face brown. Some people are named, though, after their occupation. But occupation names, there's very few people called farmer or laborer as a surname, because they were common occupations, and so it would have very little function in distinguishing people. So the people who got occupational names were people who had relatively rare occupations in a village. And so that's why a name like Smith is actually quite a common English surname, but it's only held by 1 to 2% of the population. It's because in the Middle Ages, each village would have a Smith, but typically only one Smith. And so that would distinguish that family within the village. And so there's a whole bunch of these names, but typically these would actually denote people who were actually reasonably high in the social hierarchy, right? These are skilled occupations. Another name is Wright, W-R-I-G-H-T. That's a shortening of, there's all kinds of names, Arkwright, Fanwright, Wheelwright, Plowwright. A Wright is just a craftsman, a skilled person. And so Wright is another common name. Other ones are Cooper, for someone who makes barrels, Mason, Baker, Butcher, Chandler. Chandler is someone who sells things. Cook. So that's why you get a whole class of English surnames that actually denoted people who were somewhere in the middle of the social hierarchy, right? And as I say, the surname laborer is completely non-existent because, as I say, it wouldn't distinguish anyone, right? And so we get those names, and we believe that those are formed by about 1300, right? And so if someone in England now has the name Smith, it implies typically that somewhere along the male line of descent, back in the Middle Ages, they had an ancestor who was actually a smith, right? Or you have a name Cook. It implies that somewhere in that line you had the name Cook. The name Clark, my name, comes from minor clerics in the church who were relatively highly skilled people still because they could read and write, but who were actually allowed to marry and who performed, though, these clerical functions. And so they're actually relatively close to the hierarchy. So somewhere in my past, there was an ancestor in the Middle Ages, male ancestor, who actually performed one of these functions. Now, what we can then do is, these names, as I say, are formed around 1300. What's England like in 1300? England in 1300 is still a kind of feudal society, king with barons, with knights. It's engaging in wars with Scotland. If you've seen Braveheart, Braveheart is set in exactly this period. And so this is a very early society with, as I say, we believe these very feudal institutions, strange legal system, largely rural, very small towns. And so it's a society that would seem one where you would get actually very little social mobility. That there's a lot of people also who are still technically serfs, that is, that they're owned by the lords. They're bound to the land. They're theoretically, at least, not able to move from the manor that they're born on. And so really this is England of the Middle Ages when these surnames are being formed. And what we can do is we'll say, well, what happens between then and 1600, where the Middle Ages are over and we're into what's called the early modern period, where the society is moving towards industrialization. And what we can do here is, again, we can take in 1600 two groups. We've got the indicted and we've got the rich, right? So these are people at the top of the social hierarchy in 1600 and at the bottom of the social hierarchy. And then we can say, take all of the people in each group who have surnames that implied that they had an original ancestor who was an artisan. That is, who's a plumber, smith, cook, that someone who had some skill in the past, right? And someone who's going to be in the middle of this social hierarchy. And then we can ask, what's the frequency of people with those types of names amongst the indicted and amongst the rich? Okay? And as I say, if there's no social mobility, what we would expect then is that the indicted would have very few of these names, because to get amongst the indicted, you're typically going to have to move downwards in the social scale. If there was no social mobility, we'd also expect that we wouldn't find any of these names amongst the rich, because these were people who started just as artisans. They weren't the lords, the landowners, the rich of this pre-industrial world. What we actually find is that amongst the indicted, 3.4% of them have these artisan names, surnames. And amongst the rich, 2.8%. There's actually very little difference. So the descendants of the middle class of the Middle Ages are both, by 1600, have moved down and have moved up. And in fact, they seem to have moved equally in terms of the frequency across these two groups. There's a second set of names which come from retailers. That is, from people who engage in commerce. And so the name merchant, for example, is a surname in England. The name draper, again, that's someone who sells cloth, right? These are all formed surnames in this world. And so that's another group that we can identify, chandler. They're groups of people who were, again, middle class and engaged in some kind of commerce. How frequently do they appear? 1.2% of the indicted have these names, 1.9% of the rich. So they've moved across the social spectrum by 1600. And then the last one name that we can look at is, well, what about clerk, right? Which, as I say, is a very upper class name in the Middle Ages, right? It's among this educated elite. How many of the indicted? 0.7%. How many amongst the rich? 0.6%. There's as many criminal clerks as there are rich clerks by 1600. And what it implies, as I say, is that within something like 300 or 400 years, still you're getting this complete mixing within the society. It's not a class society. There is no permanent ruling class. These guys who are at the upper end of the middle classes are moving down, and they're as frequent amongst the indicted as they are amongst the rich by the end of this period, right? The artisans, their children are moving up and down within this society. It really is a society of complete mobility, even in what we think of as the feudal period, right? And as I say, the reason this is going to be interesting is when we come to try and understand why this society can't achieve economic growth, we'll see that a lot of the simple and easy ideas are not going to apply here, right? This is a society with as much mobility, or probably more mobility, than modern America, right? It's a society of incredible economic opportunity for people, and yet we're going to see, like any other pre-industrial society, it's one mired in an absence of technological advance of rising living standards over this period. Okay, so that's enough in terms of the social structure of this world for the moment. The next big topic that we want to look at now is technological advance in the world before 1800. And the crucial feature that makes the world Malthusian, one of the crucial features, has to be that there's very little technological advance. Otherwise, there's nothing that forces incomes back to the subsistence wage in the long run. If technological advance is rapid enough, you could have superabundance in terms of population growth. You could have everyone producing 3 surviving children. Population will keep on growing very rapidly, but you won't be forced back to the subsistence wage. And so the crucial thing that defined this world is this absence of technological advance. Now, the first important thing to understand is when we say absence of technological advance, we don't mean there was no technological advance. What we mean is that the rate of technological advance was just dramatically slower than the world after 1800. There is actually a fairly steady accretion of knowledge and of techniques all the way from the original hunter-gatherers up till 1800. Though we'll see that some societies which for periods of thousands of years go into reverse and actually lose knowledge. Right? It's possible to go backwards, and there are frequently societies that go backwards in this pre-industrial world. But there is overall a kind of an upwards movement. The problem just is that the rate of productivity advance we're going to see is maybe 1/100th of what it is in the world after 1800. Right? That's an incredible difference between that world and this world. And in some sense, that's the heart of the whole issue about world economic history is, why is technological advance so slow in this world? But just to give you some illustrations of how much change there is over time, 1800 in Europe is very different from 1300 in terms of the techniques that they already know before the arrival of the Industrial Revolution. And 1300 has actually advanced very significantly on the classical world. And so we tend to have a prejudice, and this is look just at Europe, but we tend to have a prejudice and think that there's a high point that arrived with the world of the Greeks and the Romans. Then everything went into decline in Europe, and then eventually, around about the Renaissance, around about 1500 or 1600, they finally recovered the level of knowledge of the classical world. That may be true for things like how good people's Latin is or how much formal education people had. But in terms of basic production techniques, it turns out that the Romans were actually very poor, and medieval Europe had already advanced very considerably upon the knowledge of the Romans. Right? And it's just that the people who judge this tend to be in classics departments and English departments, and but based on the actual basic production technology of the society, there is actually considerable advance. So there's amazing some of the things that the Romans did not have in terms of technology. The most startling is the Romans had not yet discovered the button. Right? They didn't have, and they hadn't figured out that you can fasten clothes using buttons. And that's actually the first button that was known to history is actually found in the 1230s in an archaeological dig in Germany. And so the Romans, when they were wearing their togas, now it's part of this, the question is that just a fashion reason that they hadn't discovered that? But it turns out it's a very convenient device in terms of making clothing, but it's one apparently that was absent from this world. And interestingly, it was also absent from Asia. The claim is that the button was introduced to Asia by the Portuguese, and that the Japanese word for button actually derives from Portuguese. And so, as I say, pardon? It is in Japan? Okay. Doug can tell us. He's actually spent time, I think, in Japan. Is that right? Yep. That the Japanese word for button is actually from Europe. Another thing that the Romans didn't have was, for example, the stirrup. So in riding horses, the stirrup is a very useful device in order to keep people on. It's very important in warfare in the Middle Ages that people have stirrups, because horsemen are used as kind of shock troops, and they ride down the foot soldiers using lances. If you didn't have stirrups, when you hit them, you would just come flying off the horse. And so it's actually important in the development of warfare, the stirrup. It's actually unknown in the ancient world, and it's actually discovered in China, we believe, around about the 3rd century AD. But what's amazing about this is how simple some of these technologies are. I mean, didn't anyone looking at a horse think, well, it'd be convenient if we had some way of keeping the rider on the horse other than just gripping it with his knees? Another thing that the Romans didn't have was the horse collar. So we know from illustrations, there's lots of illustrations that survived, murals, friezes from the Roman world, that when they used horses for traction, they would basically just tie a rope around the horse's neck and have the neck haul something, have the horse haul something. That's actually very inefficient because it cuts off the blood supply to the horse and weakens their power considerably. And so horse collars, what they do is they transmit that force to the shoulders of the horse so that the horse can still breathe and get blood supply, and they become much more efficient in terms of traction. And actually, we know a lot about things like classical technology because of amateurs who in the late 19th and early 20th century started investigating, well, suppose we tried to rebuild this thing. Suppose we took the illustrations from the classical world and then harnessed horses in that way. How efficient would they be relative to later harnessing? And so that's why we know that the Romans seem to have this very inefficient system of harnessing. Another thing that the Romans lacked was actually horseshoes, which actually, again, are very important. Horses, especially in wetter climates, will tend to suffer all kinds of hoof problems if they're used in agriculture, warfare, without shoes. But again, we know from the archaeological evidence that the Romans just didn't have even these very simple technologies. By the way, recently, England is full of eccentrics. For some reason, it's a society which encourages wild eccentricity. One of these English eccentrics was featured on NPR a couple of years ago because on his farm in the west of England, he had actually rebuilt a Roman catapult to test the properties of the classical catapult. And what he was doing, though, was to test this, he was flinging around cow carcasses. And so the neighbors were complaining that as they sat in their pleasant country village, over the trees periodically would come flying dead cows as this guy experimented. He also hitched up a mini miner to the thing and flung that several hundred yards as well. And so he had a field that was littered with these stinking dead cow carcasses as a result of these experiments. But as I say, we owe a lot in terms of historical inquiry and discovery to the people who are willing to undergo this. And I think, for example, that triremes, that people have started trying to rebuild those and train crews and see how well they operate in various situations. And so that's, I mean, we can learn a lot about this technology, but what's amazing is that there's really a lot of very simple technology that's missing in this early world. And it's the fact that it's simple is important, because the question is, well, it's so simple, why wouldn't someone have discovered things like this? What else did the Romans not have? Another thing that the Romans actually don't have is spinning wheels. Clothing is a major industry in the pre-industrial world, particularly in colder climates. It can occupy 10% of the income and the activity of these societies. Spinning wheels significantly improve the productivity of people spinning. The previous technique with hand spinning and a ball of clay that it serves to actually spin the thread is much less efficient than with the spinning wheel. It can improve productivity 2 or 3-fold, and it can make also a much more regular thread. That, again, seems to be a discovery of the Middle Ages. Again, the first evidence is 1268 in France of a spinning wheel. The Romans also didn't have windmills. Again, they're clearly present in Europe. The first windmill that they have evidence for is England in 1185. The Middle Ages also discovered mechanical clocks, which are unknown in the Roman world. Spectacles, which in some sense, if you think about people's productivity in all kinds of industrial activity and their ability to maintain that productivity into the 40s and 50s and 60s, would be a huge innovation, or again, a medieval discovery. The Romans had glass. It's just that they hadn't figured out these optical properties and the way they could use these. And again, we have firearms. This is just in Europe. In China, there's an independent path of development of many of these same technologies. And actually what we'll see is that in 1400, the most advanced area of the world technologically is China. China, though, is one of these societies that actually loses technology in the pre-industrial period and actually is regressing for some reason, whereas Europe, there's no clear sign of a lot of loss of technological competence. There isn't things like road building, architecture, and stuff after the Roman era. Here's another one that's very surprising, which is the Romans did not have soap. Right? They actually, I believe, knew how to make some kind of crude soaps. But when Romans washed, what they actually had to do was they would cover themselves in oil. And then they had a strigil, a wooden implement that they would scrape the oil off with and carry away the dirt in the same way. It is, as I say, soap is such a simple compound. It is astonishing that really high-quality soaps are not discovered till the Middle Ages again. And I think that actually it's the Arab world that first starts to produce these on a large scale. But as I say, we have a high regard for the kind of the classical world. But as I say, what is amazing is, again, how little they actually knew. There's also a lot of intellectual discoveries. And so, for example, Roman numerals are very cumbersome source of arithmetic. If you try to multiply using Roman numerals, you'd see the difficulties. That, again, it's in the late medieval period in Europe that decimal notation is brought in, originally from India. If you talk about the Greeks actually had an even more primitive number system, which basically alpha was 1, beta was 2, and they could have, go along like that with numbers for 100 or 1,000, but with very, very primitive number systems. That's why you never hear about Greek numbers. And so there is actually significant change going on in this world, but what I'm going to show you is that change is just very, very, very slow, right? And I should say also, archaeologists know that there's significant change amongst the original hunter-gatherers. There are caves in Israel that have been excavated revealing the activities of people 30 to 10,000 years ago. And what they get is a record of what these hunter-gatherers were able to catch. And you can actually see a development over time where initially their diet is very limited to things that basically can't move. And gradually, you move on to catching faster and faster animals or bigger, fiercer animals. And you can actually see that in the hunter-gatherer period, there is also this significant development of technology, right? And so it's been a feature of human existence. The puzzle is, why is it so slow? Now, to think about this systematically, we have to think about, well, how do you measure technological advance? Okay? And one of the problems in economics is that it's not obvious how to simply measure the rate of innovation of a society, right? Because there are some innovations which can be quite profound, but really have very little economic impact. And there are some innovations that are very simple, but can make a very big difference, right? And so what's the metric that we're going to use to measure, well, what is the rate of innovation in a society? And we're going to use the following idea as the metric. And so to think about this early society, and what you're going to have is there's going to be a certain amount of land per person. Remember, in this world, the crucial determinant of income per person is how much land you have. That's the constraining factor in this pre-industrial world. And then on the other axis, we're going to put the amount of income per person. And the crucial thing will be that that relationship will look like this at any time in a society. Initially, where land per person is very small, if you add more land, you'll get huge increases in income per person. And you'll continue to get increases in income per person as you add more land, but at a declining rate. There's a declining marginal product of land as you add more and more of it to the society. And so, but the location of this curve is essentially determined by the technology of the society. Okay? And over time, what is going to happen is this curve will shift upwards as technology improves. And what we're going to use as our measure of the rate of technological advance is the rate, the speed at which this curve is moving upwards. Okay? And so in some sense, we're making assumptions here. We're making an assumption that the curve is moving upward uniformly across all levels of land per person. That the curve doesn't move up here and then flatten out later, right? And so there are a lot of simplifying assumptions about how we're conceiving technology, but we're just thinking of it as some unifying force that's expanding the possibilities given a set of endowments of land per person, okay? And the way that we'll measure this in the book is we'll measure this rate of technological advance as the growth rate of A, where A is going to be our symbol for the efficiency level of the society. Okay? And this growth rate will be measured in percent per year. And if we did such a measure in the modern world, after 1800, for successful societies, that rate of technological advance is about 1 to 2% per year. So what it says is that in the modern world, with a fixed endowment of capital and land, we can produce about 1 or 2% more output per year. And it's happening still in America. We're getting richer all the time because of that flow of technological innovations, and it pushes up the possibilities, okay? And what we want to try and think about is, well, what's that rate of advance earlier, right? Now, if I just tell you, oh, they invented spectacles in the Middle Ages, you could say, well, how much does that correspond to in terms of this measure, right? And you can see that it's not going to be in any easy way looking at these techniques. It's going to be very hard to figure out, well, how much does that correspond? But here's what we can use. This is what's going to happen, as I say, with an advance in technology. So if we start off at some initial point in the society, we should be at the subsistence level of income, Y star. And that'll determine how much land there's going to be per person, right? So the Malthusian mechanism will bring us to this subsistence level of income, and that'll determine the amount of land per person. And then we have some growth rate of efficiency that's occurring here. Now, what will happen in the short run is that people will get richer. But the crucial thing about this Malthusian world is that that short-run effect will simply result in a long-run population gain. And so what happens in the long run is that that growth rate of efficiency gets translated into a decline in the amount of land per person. Population goes up, land per person declines, and you move back to this income level. And so this part here is the growth rate of population. And so what it turns out in this Malthusian world is that the growth rate of efficiency is actually going to produce a growth rate of population. And all we need to do is be able to say, what's the strength of that relationship? What's the connection between these two things? And then we can actually measure over very long periods what the growth rate of efficiency was in the pre-industrial world. We're going to measure it by looking at the growth rates of population in the pre-industrial world. And as I say, the crucial thing just is to figure out, well, what's the relationship between these two things. What I'm going to do now is just tell you what that relationship is. And then soon in section, Doug is actually going to start to show you how we can derive that from first principles, right? That when we think about economic growth, it's actually possible to show that this is going to be a fundamental relationship in the world, right? But we're going to go, and when we start thinking about growth, then we can actually derive this relationship as well. So for the moment, I'm just going to assert what that relationship is. And what that relationship is going to be is that the growth rate of population in percent in a Malthusian world will be 1 over C times the growth rate of efficiency, where C is the share of the income of the society which goes to the owners of land and natural resources. Okay? And so C is just going to be how much of the income actually goes to the owners of land and natural resources. We can measure that share for pre-industrial England all the way back to about 1200? And the answer is it's about 0.2. 20% of the income in England before 1800 went to the owners of land. Land rents constituted about 20% of the output of the society, the income of the society. We could also do these measures in China for before 1800 or in some other instances, and it seems consistent with the idea that that number is around about a fifth or a quarter in these pre-industrial societies. And so what that says is that a 1% growth of efficiency in the pre-industrial world produces a 5% gain in population. Okay? And what it also says, just by inverting this equation, is if we want to calculate the growth rate of efficiency in the world before 1800, then all we need to do is take C times the growth rate of population. Okay? That's just multiplying both sides here by C. What we actually have is there is our measure of technological advance in the world economy in the Malthusian era. And so what it says is whatever the population growth rate is, if we multiply that by a fifth, it should measure roughly what the rate of technological advance is. And what's the intuition for that here? Well, it turns out that C here is going to tell us what the curvature of this relationship is. The larger is C, the more sharply curved that relationship will be. And the more sharply curved it is, the less the growth of efficiency will actually produce a growth of population and a decline of land per person. Okay? The more smoothly curved this thing is, then the more a growth of efficiency will result in a very large decline in the amount of land per person. And that turns out to be indexed by what's the share of income that goes to the owners of land. So it's telling us how important is land in production. The more important land is in production, then the less can a growth of efficiency lead to a decline in the amount of land per person, because then income drops very sharply if land is very important in production. And what's measuring that importance is, well, what share of income actually goes to landowners, okay? And so that's the first thing. And then just before I let you go, the second important thing to understand is that, as I say, this is a very limited concept of technological advance. It's measuring technological advance only in terms of how much of measured output in the society comes from that. There's going to be a lot of technological advances which are fascinating and incredible and beautiful, and some of the mathematical results are just Fermat's last theorem, right? That has no role. That can't get measured by this kind of measure. But it's simple things like horses' hooves, windmills, all of those things that increase the measured output of the society. Those are the things that we're going to measure through this thing. And so what I'm going to do next time then is just to give you some numbers. We have estimates of world population and show you that that implies an incredibly slow rate of technological advance in the world for 100,000 years before the Industrial Revolution. Okay.